Hello again, Muscombe History Group channel once more, and I'm afraid it's me again. This programme continues our history of Nottinghamshire industry. We've already looked at coal mining and lace making, and we'll shortly be covering bicycles, pharmaceuticals and farming. But this programme will cover an industry with a less popular story: Britain and the drug-fuelled economy. Or a short history of the rise and fall of tobacco smoking in Britain. Today, we seem to be studying history as a series of value judgment narratives rather than a history of facts. Historically, our ancestors may have done something wrong, so tear down the statues, deface the portraits, expunge the evidence, apologize for it, and rewrite the facts to say we didn't really do it, and we certainly would not have done it. And anyway, we are sorry, so can we just forget about it? But unfortunately, the facts remain. Britain and the drug-fueled economy started with an actual war which we did fight in China to preserve the lucrative opium trade. And we did encourage tobacco smoking to gain the tax revenue that it generated. So is this a story that should be forgotten and consigned to the wastepaper basket of history? Or is it a story we should remember? A story of 200 years when much of the national economy was massively financed by a totally legal but dangerously addictive drug called nicotine. It's a historical fact. There was once a time when almost everybody smoked some type of tobacco product, and an industry thrived. And almost everybody listened to the summaries of the budget speech to find out what the Chancellor had done about the tax duty on tobacco products. And a major centre for the manufacture of tobacco products was Nottingham. Lace, bicycles, pharmaceuticals, light engineering, and tobacco products, with John Player and Sons Limited. And there was once a time when wherever a group of people gathered together, in a theatre or a pub, or in the office, or on the top deck of a bus, or even in a restaurant, a thick blue fog would slowly descend from the ceiling as everyone in the place started to smoke. So how did this habit start? Or who or what persuaded us to kill ourselves in pursuit of happiness? It seems to have started about 2,000 years ago, when the Mayan Indians discovered that some of the leaves of a sacred plant could be dried, rolled, and smoked. So smoking tobacco became part of the ritual and a pleasant way of talking to God. By the time the Europeans were discovering America in the 15th and 16th century, many of the indigenous tribes wished to smoke a pipe of peace. And it wasn't long before we started to trade with the native tribes, trading tobacco for better tools or beads and baubles. It wasn't much longer before ships were returning to Europe and bringing with them tobacco plants and the means to grow them. Many of the sailors quickly got the hang of smoking the cargo and carouseling in the alehouses whilst puffing on their pipes. Indeed, a certain smoker named Rodrigo de Yares was put in prison for consorting with the devil when he blew smoke down his nose. Jean-Nicole de Villemain, a French diplomat, in 1559 he was sent to the court of Portugal, tasked with arranging a marriage between Margaret de Valois and the young Prince Sebastian, a 3-year-old heir to the Portuguese throne. He discovered the medicinal properties claimed for a newly discovered plant which was to take his name, Nicotina rustica. He sent seeds of tobacco and several other newly discovered plants, with samples of snuff and other products, to the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, and she was persuaded of the medicinal value of tobacco and encouraged its growth and use in France. It is known that the English captain Sir John Hawkins brought tobacco into England, and it is generally thought that it was the courtier Sir Walter Raleigh who spread its popularity in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. But the most likely ambassadors of the smoking habit in England were the sailors who came into port at Bristol smoking the proceeds of the slaving triangle. Even in England, the first market was for the medicinal qualities of tobacco. It was sold by apothecaries and herbalists and became known as a cure-all plant. It was even claimed it could cure cancer. However, smoking soon became popular for its pleasant odors and tastes, and pipe smoking and taking snuff became habitual in most walks of life. Smoking became widespread, and soon smoking products were being sold by public houses, grocers, chandlers, drapers, and even goldsmiths and jewelers. Almost from the beginning, there was an anti-smoking lobby. King James I in 1604 wrote a counterblast to tobacco, and he prohibited the growing of tobacco in his realm on the grounds that it would reduce the growing of food. But in 1614 he found himself short of money again, and decided on a new approach. He sold the monopolies of tobacco imports to 2 traders for the sum of £3,500 in the first year and £7,000 for each year thereafter, and he decreed that tobacco should only be landed at the port of London. So, almost from the beginning, there was a link between taxation for the benefit of the nation, or in this case, the benefit of the sovereign, and the drug nicotine. It was not long before the London restriction was lifted, and in 1638 Bristol, Plymouth, Dartmouth and Southampton all became major tobacco importers. In the meantime, the farmers of Gloucestershire, Worcestershire and Somerset, and others, continued to grow fields of tobacco against the law. However, it was not long before the smoking public demanded access to the better quality American leaves, so home-grown tobacco began to fail. Suddenly, the plague reached Europe and came on to Britain. Smoking tobacco was explained as a preventative and curative remedy. From now on, smoking would not look back until the beginning of the 21st century. And monarchs all over Europe will follow the example of James I and made smoking a taxable pursuit. From now onwards, the lawmaker's dilemma would be the legal restricting of smoking to avoid its harmful effects, and encouraging smoking so as to benefit from its almost incalculable tax income benefits. So from the 1700s, the trade grew. It is estimated that between 1702 and 1709, every person in the country consumed 2 pounds of tobacco every year. 11,260,659 pounds used nationally per annum. Surprisingly, however, the development of tobacco products was not made by the tobacco importers and traders. It was left to those who sold tobacco from their high street retail outlets to develop the industrial products. Grocers, publicans and chandlers. But the industry now grew rapidly. Pipe smoking, snuff, and the newly developed cigars became market commodities. New markets with decorated snuff boxes and ornamentally carved pipes became established in the art world. Snuff mills were developed at London, Bristol, Sheffield and Kendal. With the coming of the Regency, snuff-taking became the acceptable side of tobacco. Indeed, Beau Brummel actually banned pipe smoking in the public rooms at Bath. Men and women became habitual snuff-takers, with an entire etiquette associated with its taking in the upper classes of society. But still the lower classes preferred the pipe of tobacco. By 1775, Britain's imports of American tobacco had reached £101 million per annum. At this time, many smokers and potential smokers were often unable to read and write, so tobacco shops had life-size carvings, wooden and painted statues of guardsmen, native Indians, Saracen Turks and the like placed outside the store to attract the customers. And a new smoking product became popular with the discerning gentleman. Cigars were known and familiar to Christopher Columbus, but their manufacture in Europe did not start until 1735, when the early tobacconists rolled their own cigars for discerning customers. Another tobacco product that quickly becomes popular as the cigar builds up conventions, standards, and eventually traditions all of its own. And an early manufacturer on a national scale is Lambert and Butler of London. Then came the Crimean War, where British soldiers saw soldiers from France, Turkey, Italy, and even Russia smoking small cigars that apparently had paper wrapped around them. Britain has discovered the cigarette. With a product that now deserved mass production, it meant that the tobacco industry, like Topsy, began to grow and grow. The first English factory was set up in 1851 by Robert Peacock Gloag, manufacturing cigarettes that were called Sultanas, Rifles, Zetlands, Operas, and Moscows. Firstly made by skilled workers from abroad, then made by young English women, newly trained to the work. The main advantage in manufacturing cigarettes is that they lent themselves to machine manufacture, and a true industry could be developed around them. An American named James Bonsack patented a machine that made 200 cigarettes in a minute, and 2 of these were bought for £4,000 each by W.D. and H.O. Wills of Bristol. And their chief engineer, Mr. H.H. Wills, then invented a packing machine, and the company became a runaway success. W.D. and H.O. Wills put a series of popular cigarette brands into the market that will become internationally known and will be familiar even to non-smokers. As the industry developed, government taxation schemes benefited. By 1880, taxation income was approaching £1 billion per year, a major slice of the national taxation economy. By the 1900s, a single Bonsack machine is now capable of producing 600 cigarettes per minute, and the industry is producing cigarettes in large quantities as newcomers enter the market. Cigars, snuff, pipe tobacco, chewing tobacco, and dipping tobacco are all popular with their niche users, but it is cigarettes that represent the real growth potential in the market. Also, by the 1900s, an estimated 350,000 retailers are selling tobacco goods, and about 80% of the UK production is sold to the home market. So, how did the tobacco industry come to Nottingham? John Player was born in Saffron Walden, and he came to Nottingham around 1862. He worked as a draper's clerk and soon set up in a shop on Beast Market Hill in Nottingham, where he acted as an agent for Prentice & Co.'s agricultural manures and seeds. He also sold pre-wrapped tobacco from the shop, and it proved so popular that it soon became his main business. In 1860, John Player married Anne Goodacre. They had 2 sons, John Dane Player and William Goodacre Player, and in 1877, John Player bought William Wright's tobacco factory in the Broadmarsh, Nottingham. He also opened 2 more shops selling tobacco products, one in Sheep Lane and later one in Market Street. His business quickly expanded, and in 1881 he bought land in Radford and had 3 factories built on the site. The Castle Tobacco Factory was opened in 1884 in one of these locations. Initially, the remaining two factories were leased to local lace manufacturers, but by 1900, tobacco was being processed at all three sites. John Player died in December of 1884. For the next 9 years, the business was run by a small group of family friends until John Player's sons were ready to take over the firm in 1893. In 1895, the business became a private limited company with a share capital of £200,000, so by now the company is a major player in the tobacco industry. The threat comes from the USA, where in 1901 a powerful association of American tobacco manufacturers launched an attack on the British market. In an effort to take over the British tobacco industry, James Buchanan Duke's American Tobacco Company, the ATC, set aside a massive $30 million to buy up all the British tobacco companies one by one. Duke walked off the ship in Liverpool and walked straight into Ogden's Liverpool factory and bought it on the spot. It is then said that he walked into John Player's boardroom and said, "Hello, boys, I'm Duke from New York. I've come to take over your business." He was immediately removed from the premises. Facing such resistance, Duke paused to consider his situation. Duke's delay gave the 13 family-run tobacco businesses of Britain, led by Wills, Players and Lambert and Butler, time to meet. In December 1901, the Imperial Tobacco Company, Great Britain and Northern Ireland Limited, was formed. The threat from ATC was beaten off, and the 13 firms became branches of Imperial Tobacco Company. However, they still continued to trade under their own names and openly competed with each other for business. At the formation of the new company, WG and JD Players were invited to join the board of directors. The company's first chairman was Sir William Henry Wills of WD and H.O. Wills of Bristol, and the ATC threat had been averted. Another American idea arrived with the stiffener. The paper packet in which cigarettes were packed at the end of the 19th century meant that some cigarettes could be bent and damaged when carried in purse or pocket. To prevent this damage, a stiff cardboard cut to size was placed inside the packet to stiffen it. An enterprising journalist decided that this was a free advertising space. By the 1900s, the stiffener had become the cigarette card, and collecting sets of cigarette cards became a subtle sales aid to the industry. WD and H.O. Wills of Bristol started with cigarette cards in the 1880s, and by 1900 all the Imperial Tobacco companies had followed. Collecting the sets of cards became a pressure to continue smoking, and they were collected by boys and adults alike. By now, The governments of almost every country in Europe and the USA were heavily dependent on tobacco taxation for their income, but a new danger was approaching that would give a significant boost to tobacco consumption. The arrival of World War I meant fighting troops were actually encouraged to smoke. Smoking was something that could be shared by officers and other ranks. And even the folks left at home could be encouraged to support their smoker soldiers. And tobacco companies were only too glad to satisfy the growth in demand. And help to boost the morale of our fighting soldiers, sailors, and airmen. When the victory came in November of 1918, the tobacco companies were there to celebrate. Cigarette consumption rose steadily through the war and on to the second conflict, flattened slightly as the troops were coming home, and dropped dramatically during the recession of the 1930s. John Player and Son continued to expand during the interwar years, building 2 new factories and a bonded warehouse in Nottingham. In 1926, W.G. and J.D. Player retired from the board of Imperial Tobacco, but continued to take an interest in the affairs of their father's business until 1932. And a new gimmick was introduced with cigarette card stiffeners, collecting cards in sets to fit together like a sort of jigsaw puzzle and create a famous work of art, which can be fastened onto a board and framed and hung on a wall. By 1938, the weight of tobacco being consumed in Britain was £2 million, with £150 million being used for cigarettes. In 1924, Imperial Tobacco Limited acquired a 51% share of the independent competitor Goodacre to prevent a takeover by the American Tobacco Company. However, ITL promised not to interfere in the management of Goodacre, an undertaking that was scrupulously observed. Then came the Second World War. The Board of Trade maintained control of tobacco leaf purchases, and cigarette cards and certain packing materials were discontinued because of war shortages. The country had about 3 years of tobacco in stock, but imports were drastically reduced, so production had to be carefully managed to meet the demand of the forces and civilian markets. Tobacco products were considered an essential part of national morale. When the war ended, America's demand for Lend-Lease debts to be repaid meant a dollar shortage in the country. Tobacco manufacturers had to look to the British Commonwealth, Greek, Turkish, Oriental, and even home-grown leaf, causing the growth of the market to slow down significantly. The war years have been seen steady growth, but this was slowed in 1947 by a large increase in duty charges. Between 1946 and 1949, tobacco sales reduced from £99 million to £82 million. That's pounds of weight, not money. But from the 1950s, the trend reversed. In 1940, duty charged on every pound of tobacco was 13 shillings and sixpence, 68 pence in today's money. By 1947, it had risen to £1, 5 shillings and sixpence per pound of tobacco, and by 1948 it was £2, 14 shillings and 10 pence per pound of tobacco. That's £2.74 in today's money. Several aspects of the market were changed, with several manufacturers disappearing and the packaging of cigarette cards also disappearing because of the imposition of purchase tax. However, the government discovers that severe taxation on tobacco products only slows the growth of sales for a short period. Tobacco becomes a valuable source of taxation income for the country. As early as the 1920s, a few manufacturers had included coupons in selected brands that could be exchanged for goods an equivalent cash value to that shown on the coupons. This was then controlled and basically banned by the Martin Agreement. In 1956, the Restrictive Trade Protection Act was repealed, and coupon schemes slowly returned, but soon all the main manufacturers had coupons. Another change in the market came with the first serious concerns about smoking and its effect on health and life expectancy. Without accepting any suggestion that the relationship was true, the industry began to push filter tips, with the implication that they filtered most of the harmful carcinogenic particles. Some brands had always maintained the idea that filters helped maintain good health. By the 1950s, almost every brand had a filter tip version on offer because the manufacturers had obtained tip cigarette making machines. Filter tips actually increased the profit contribution by occupying space that would previously be filled with taxable tobacco, or it allowed the development of the king-size cigarette. John Players at Nottingham continued to grow, with production reaching its peak in the late 1950s, producing 15 brands of pipe tobacco and 11 brands of cigarettes. Players was now employing 11,000 workers, as compared with 5,000 in 1926. It was becoming a vital part of the Nottinghamshire economy. But by the 1960s, the pressure from the health lobbies was beginning to have traction, and the relationship was more clearly explained. As life expectancy became more predictable, the links between smoking and cancer began seriously to affect the market. One solution was to link cigarette smoking with fitness by linking sponsorship with sporting events. With a sport that could burn money very quickly. By the 1960s, you recognized the drivers of Formula One cars by the cigarette brands they drove. Sponsorship and hospitality became the subtle advertising of pleasure linked to fitness when you smoke. Often the sports types would actually smoke the product that sponsored their sport. Almost everyone had an uncle or granddad who had smoked for 60 years, and it didn't do him any harm. By the late 1950s, cigarette making and packing had become highly mechanized, with companies such as Moulins equipping entire factories with cigarette making machines. And the factories produced cigarettes by the billions, distributed by some of the most complex and reliable logistics systems known. By the 1970s, the correlation of smoking and lung cancer was being heavily contested in Britain by the General Medical Council and the tobacco industry, and by non-smokers and smokers. The health risk appeared to be specially aimed at the tar associated with cigarette smoking, so some smokers switched to cigars and even pipes. And the industry went for low-tar cigarettes. A pneumatic process puffs the tobacco strands up, giving less weight of tobacco per bulk in any given cigarette, and fill goes further, and therefore less tobacco tar will be found in any given cigarette. And as it happens, the industry, which is coming under immense pressure, uses less tobacco to make several billion low-tar cigarettes, so everyone is happy. And now begins a genuine dilemma for government and industry. The tobacco companies are looking to expand their business in face of the health threat evidence. From the 1960s, duty on cigarettes, which are the most popular of all tobacco products in England, began to increase rapidly. However, it is not until the 1980s that tobacco taxation really becomes the main tool and part of the policy in fighting the ills of smoking. The industry's argument was that tobacco taxes paid almost for the entire National Health Service. In the 1950s, tobacco represented £1,061,000,000, which was the equivalent at that time to 7% of national consumer spending on goods and services. In the 1980s, it had increased to £8,196,000,000, 2.5% of the national consumer spending on goods and services at that time. But people still saw smoking as a fundamental freedom, and the duty they were required to pay was an unavoidable penalty for their pleasure. In the early 1980s, smoking was still considered the normal behavior of adults. In 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community, and with it came a complete overhaul of the way that taxes were charged on tobacco products, and the potential of significant new markets for British tobacco manufacturers. ITL made significant investments into new plant and factory space. In 1972, players opened their new Horizon factory on the Lenton Industrial Estate in Nottingham. At the time, it was considered to be the most advanced factory of its kind in the world. Production continued at the Radford factories until 1974 and 1976, when the number 1 and number 2 factories were closed completely, and all manufacture was transferred to the Lenton Horizon factory. In 1986, the Imperial Tobacco Group was taken over by the Hanson Trust. The new generation of cigarette-making machinery housed in the Horizon factory massively increased the speed of manufacture. The new machines could produce and pack 4,000 to 5,000 cigarettes every minute. Deals were made trading the old generation of machines and the operating expertise to set up tobacco industries in the emerging economies of Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, to meet the general market in those countries and provide governments with an income from duty, in exchange for top European brands being exported to those countries to meet the smoking needs of the top end of their markets. From 1993, Kenneth Clarke was Chancellor, and he was a supporter of the tobacco industry that provided employment in his Nottingham constituency. But he made a clear commitment on behalf of the government to discourage smoking by increasing tobacco duties annually in real terms by at least 3% on average per annum. Discouragement became even more pointed in 1997 when a new Labour government announced it would raise cigarette taxes by at least 5% above the inflation rate every year. This new commitment was carried through in both the 1998 and 1999 budgets. But in November of 1999, the prudent effect of a deflationary economy meant Chancellor Brown had to abandon this policy. Instead, it was announced that extra revenue would be raised from future tobacco tax rises and would be spent exclusively on healthcare in Great Britain. The link between tax and health provision is finally made clear. With the new millennium, the industry fought against the effects of increased taxation. The tobacco industry keeps the price of its cheapest cigarettes almost static, despite various increases in tobacco taxes. The effect limited the impact of the United Kingdom's public health policy to reduce smoking through higher taxation and increasing prices. As a result, the price of cheaper cigarettes has remained almost unchanged since 2006, and their market share has doubled compared to expensive premium cigarettes. This means that as cigarette taxes are raised, many smokers simply trade down to cheaper cigarettes and just carry on smoking. The latest hyper-speed cigarette machinery again increases the speed of manufacture and keeps costs down. The new machines produce and pack more than 7,000 cigarettes every minute. That's approximately 3,057,600,000 cigarettes per machine per year. Several hyperspeed machines are based at Horizon's factory in Nottingham. But the social pressure is becoming too great. Finally, the message of secondary smoking damage begins to make the impact that taxes and personal health didn't make. The idea that even standing by someone who is smoking can immediately give you lung cancer begins to outlaw the habit. Bans in public places and public venues pick up momentum. The industry left Nottingham in 2016, with the Horizon factory closing at its peak of production at 52 billion cigarettes per year. 1 billion cigarettes every week. With that, all cigarette production came to an end. And in 2019, the Horizon factory was demolished. British American Tobacco is still based in the UK, but only has an estimated 8% share of the UK's cigarette market. Most of British American Tobacco's global tobacco activities in the USA, Brazil, and Germany are controlled by BAT in the UK. In 2015, BAT produced 663 billion cigarettes. Worldwide, that's down by 0.5% on the 667 billion cigarettes of 2014, and reported an operating profit of £4,557 million, an increase of 0.2% on the £4,546 million made in 2014. Most cigarettes now smoked in the UK are imported from Imperial Brands and Japan Tobacco International. The UK smokers' sales are still approaching £12 billion per annum, but we have given up on the employment advantages of manufacturing tobacco products in this country. And the UK vapour market is expected to reach £4.5 billion by 2021. It is a good thing that smoking has become an antisocial habit. But we should not forget that for decades, smokers have made a considerable contribution to the UK tax economy, and that players made an important contribution to the city and county of Nottingham, both by payment of wages and also by the distribution of wealth in the area's economies. We should not rewrite history simply because we don't agree with the values of the then time. The smoker economy was a fact for hundreds of years, and standing by someone who is smoking for a couple of minutes will not immediately give you lung cancer. People have died and will continue to die of smoking-related illnesses, but we must not deny that even in that knowledge, people chose, and some still choose, to take their chances and smoke. Remember, living is a fatal illness. Goodbye now.